Husband forces pregnant wife to carry sacks of corn, but a horseman sees and... The sun was beating down hard that afternoon when Clara felt the sack slip from her shoulder for the third time. She shifted the weight with both hands, closed her eyes for a second and kept walking. There was no point in stopping. There was no point in complaining. She already knew that. "Pick that sack up right, woman!" Hank's voice came sharp. In that way he had. "You think corn gets carried with sloppiness?" She didn't answer. The weight of the golden grains pressed against the top of her head, and her 7-month belly weighed heavy in front, pulling at the center of her body in a way that no position could relieve. The heat was dry, the kind that dries out your throat before you even feel thirsty. The dirt road stretched ahead with no shade in sight, the color of old sand, with a fine dust that rose with every step and clung to her ankles. Hank walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, his straw hat tilted to one side, carrying absolutely nothing. There were 2 more sacks to bring from the granary to the truck, waiting at the end of the path. 2 sacks he could very well have put on his own shoulder. Any person with common sense would understand they weren't for her. Not like that, not in her condition. But common sense that afternoon wasn't with Hank. That's when the dust rose at the end of the road, the sound of hooves beating slowly, steadily, like someone in no hurry but also not stopping, and a man appeared, riding a bay horse, back straight, with that posture you recognize in people who have lived a lot and learned from almost all of it. Mr. Samuel Thompson was 68 years old, had a small ranch on this side of the river, and a reputation nobody needed to explain in that region. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man who saw, and who didn't ride past when something wasn't right. That afternoon he saw. He held the reins. The horse stopped slowly in quiet obedience. The old man's eyes went from Clara to Hank, from the 7-month belly to the sack of corn, from Hank's free hands to Clara's feet, which stepped carefully on the uneven ground, trying to keep her balance under a weight that wasn't hers to carry. Hank. The voice came out deep, without tension, but with a weight that didn't need volume to make itself felt. Hank turned his face. When he recognized who it was, his chin rose a little. "Mr. Samuel Thompson, good afternoon. What is that woman carrying?" "Corn." The answer was short, dry. "I can see what she's carrying. I asked why." Hank turned his whole body, with that posture of someone preparing to defend something that deep down he knows has no defense. "She's my wife, and this is her job, Mr. Samuel Thompson. With all due respect, this is none of your business." Clara kept walking. She didn't stop. She didn't expect stopping to change anything. She had already learned that waiting around for help makes you heavier than any sack of corn. But Mr. Samuel Thompson got off the horse. "Look, when I first read this part, I stopped for a while before continuing, because there's something very particular about that gesture. A man of nearly 70 getting off a horse in the middle of the afternoon heat to get involved in a matter he could easily ignore. There's something rare in that, something you don't see every day." He walked slowly over to Clara without asking anyone's permission. "Give me that, dear." Clara stopped. She looked at him. Then she looked at her husband, whose face was closed, his eyes hard. She knew that look. It was the look of what came after. "Hank," she began softly, almost a plea for her husband not to cause a scene. "Let the man have his opinions," Hank said, biting off the words, "and you keep walking." Mr. Samuel Thompson didn't wait any longer. He reached for the sack himself, with a firmness that surprised Clara, and took the weight off her head. He balanced it in his own hand for a second, felt how heavy it was, and set it on the ground with a dull thud. "You're not carrying this anymore today." The silence that followed was one of those that hurts everyone nearby. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just getting started. Now continuing. Hank walked over to them. Each step was calculated, the kind of walk you recognize when someone wants to show they have authority over something or someone. "Mr. Samuel Thompson, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is my property, my corn and my family. Are you looking for trouble?" "I don't want any trouble." Samuel stood facing him without moving. "I want you to carry that sack." Are you giving me orders now? No, I'm asking you to see what everyone who passes on this road can see. Samuel's eyes went to Clara's belly, then back to Hank's face. That woman is going to have your child in 2 months. You're making her carry a sack of corn in the noonday heat, on a road with no shade. She's healthy, the midwife said she's healthy if she's resting. Samuel's voice dropped a tone, not in anger, in something harder to name. I was at the same general store as you when you two talked to her. Don't give me that. Hank closed his mouth. Clara looked up. There was something she didn't know, something happening underneath that conversation, a current she couldn't see clearly but felt in her feet. Are you leaving or staying? Hank asked, but his voice had lost some of its earlier harshness. I'm staying until you carry that sack. It was a standoff. And on that dirt road with the sun slowly going down and the dust settling, it was the kind of standoff that isn't resolved by shouting or by fighting. Hank stood still for too long. Clara stood to the side, not knowing where to look, not knowing what to hope for. Then, in a way she never would have expected, her husband bent down, picked up the sack, put it on his shoulder, and walked toward the truck without saying anything else. She watched him walk away in the dust. Something inside her chest stirred in a strange way. It wasn't complete relief. It was more like a question she still didn't know how to formulate. How are you? Samuel asked very quietly, without seeming to intrude. Clara took a second. I am. He understood that I am carried so much more than those 2 little words said. In the days that followed, life went back to routine. Hank didn't talk about what happened on the road. He didn't mention Mr. Samuel Thompson, he didn't apologize. But he also didn't ask Clara to carry anything heavy again. The silence between them was old. It had started long before the corn, long before the pregnancy. It had started in a place that Clara sometimes tried to remember precisely, and couldn't. Like when you try to grab hold of a dream in the morning and it fades away as you wake up. She had come from a small town in the Ozarks to marry Hank when she was 23. He was the son of the tenant farmer who worked the land in that region, a young man with broad shoulders and an easy smile who knew how to make a woman feel seen. In the early days, he was attentive. He'd open the gate before she walked through. He'd save the bigger slice of fruit for her. He'd ask how she was as if the answer were the most important thing of the day. You can't say exactly when that started to go away. Those things don't usually have a date. What Clara knew was that the Hank of now carried a tension he could never keep contained anywhere. It exploded in small things, in the way he'd throw the dish in the sink, in the voice he used to talk to her in front of others. In her mind, she had to earn rest, as if rest was something you gain rather than something every human being has a right to. And she was carrying a life inside her. Sometimes at night, when Hank was already asleep, Clara would place her hand on her belly and just feel the baby's movements. It was in those moments that she could truly breathe. It was in those moments that she thought of the name she had chosen on her own. Abigail, if it was a girl. Silas, if it was a boy. She hadn't told her husband yet. She didn't know how that conversation would end. 2 days after the encounter on the road, Mr. Samuel Thompson appeared at their front door. Hank was out in the fields. Clara opened the door and stood looking at the old man with that wariness of someone who doesn't know what to expect. Sorry to bother you. He took off his hat. Came to bring this. He held out a basket covered with a cotton cloth. Inside were peaches, a piece of brown sugar loaf, and a small bundle of herbs that Clara recognized as lemon balm tea. My wife sent it. She found out about the pregnancy and wanted to send something. Clara looked at the basket, then at him. Your wife? Mrs. Martha Thompson. She knows you by sight. You've crossed paths at the general store a few times. Samuel gave that kind of easy smile from someone with no ulterior motives in the world. She wanted to come in person, but her knee is acting up today. Clara took the basket. She felt its light weight, so different from what she was used to carrying. Thank you for the gift and for the other day. Samuel was quiet for a second. Then he said, Can I ask you a question? She nodded. Do you have family nearby? The question hit her like a stone in her chest. Clara took a while to answer. I have my mother and a sister in the Ozarks. We keep in touch by letter every now and then. She paused. It's been a while since I wrote. How long? She had to think. And when she realized the answer, she went quiet. Over a year. Samuel didn't say anything, but his look said enough. After he left, Clara sat on the doorstep with the basket in her lap for a long time. The peaches smelled good. She would make the tea that night. And something inside her, something that had stayed very still for a very long time, began to stir slowly, like someone waking from a long sleep and not quite knowing where they are yet. She got paper and a pencil that same afternoon, and she began to write to her mother. I had to take a deep breath here, because sometimes people disappear from the lives of those they love without even realizing they're gone. You keep putting it off. You keep saying later. And suddenly, a year has passed. That touched me more than I expected. The letter Clara wrote didn't tell everything, but it told enough. She said she was pregnant, that she missed her, and that she wanted her mother to come before the birth if she could. She folded the paper 3 times, placed it inside the envelope, and asked the neighbor to take it to the general store the next day to send along with the order. When Hank came back from the fields that night, Clara was in the kitchen. The smell of lemon balm tea filled the room. He looked at the basket on the table. What is that? Mrs. Martha sent it, Mr. Samuel Thompson's wife. Something crossed Hank's face. It wasn't exactly anger, it was something closer to embarrassment. Were they talking about me? No. Clara set the cup in front of him. She sent it because she found out about the pregnancy and wanted to send something. Hank stood looking at the cup. He didn't drink it right away. Hank. Clara's voice came out firmer than she expected. I need to tell you something. He looked up. I wrote to my mother today. I asked her to come before the birth. The silence that followed had a different texture from their usual silences. Hank kept looking at the table. The muscle in his jaw moved. You did that without asking me? I did. She didn't look away. She's my mother. There was a long pause. Then Hank pushed his chair back, got up and went out to the porch without saying another word. That night was tense, but it passed. And the next morning, when Clara woke up early and went to the kitchen, she found Hank already awake, sitting in the same chair from the night before with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It was the kind of face you have when you've spent the whole night arguing with your own thoughts and the thoughts won. My mother never let me stop, he said suddenly, with no warning at all. Clara stood still in the middle of the room. She looked at him. When I was a boy, she said, a man who rests is a man who fails. That work has no hours, no limits. He looked at his own hands spread out on the table. My father stayed quiet, never argued with her, never argued with anyone. Clara pulled out her chair slowly and sat down. She said nothing. She knew this was the kind of moment where the wrong word shuts everything back down. I know what I do is wrong, he continued, struggling. It wasn't just that day with the corn. It wasn't just once. He paused. I don't know how to stop when it hits. What is it? He thought for a while. Fear. She hadn't expected that word. Fear of what, Hank? Of not being able to handle it. He looked at her belly. A baby on the way, the tenant farming debt, this harvest coming in below what we needed. I've got all of that in here and I don't know where to put it. He pointed at his own chest. So I put it on you, because you're the only one who isn't going to leave. There are things you hear that make you feel like you know that pain from somewhere. It doesn't justify what he did. Not at all, not under any circumstances. But it explains where it comes from. And sometimes understanding the root is the first step to pulling it out. Clara kept looking at him for a while. This man she had loved, who she still loved in a way she couldn't quite name, who hurt her without knowing how to do any different, or maybe knowing, but trapped in a pattern no one had ever taught him how to break. You should have told me about the debt, she said at last. I didn't want to worry you. I'm your wife, Hank. Worry is something we share. A sack of corn when I'm 7 months pregnant is not. He closed his eyes. It was a small thing, that closing of the eyes. But Clara could feel it was real. "How much do we owe?" she asked. He told her the amount. It was high. She didn't give him the shocked reaction he was probably expecting. She sat thinking in silence. "My sister has some money saved up. She offered to help me once, and I didn't want to accept because I knew you'd think, because you knew I'd think you were humiliating me in front of her family." He finished the sentence. "I know. I would have thought that. And today, would you still think that?" He took longer to answer this time. "Today, I don't think I would." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. But things don't get resolved over one breakfast. Clara already knew that. Anyone who has lived long enough knows that a conversation can open a door, but walking through that door takes many days of work. In the days that followed, there were steps forward and steps back. Hank had opened something that had been closed for a long time, but old habits have deep roots and don't let go easily. At times he slipped, raised his voice, stormed out, slamming the porch door with that irritation he still hadn't learned to swallow. And Clara, who had hoped one conversation would change everything at once, had to learn that change is slow and uneven, like a plant that grows but doesn't always grow in a straight line. What really changed was that she stopped swallowing things down. When he raised his voice, she answered, not with a scream, but with firmness. When he tried to make her feel like she was asking too much for wanting to rest, she would stand up, look him in the eyes and calmly say, "I'm going to sit down, Hank. My belly's heavy, and I need to sit." It wasn't easy. It cost her something every time, but she did it. And Mr. Samuel Thompson kept passing by on the road every now and then. He didn't come in, he didn't meddle, but he passed by. And when he saw Clara on the porch, he waved, and she waved back. That kind of small thing that carries a silent message. Someone's watching. Someone cares. You're not alone in this. 3 weeks after the letter, Clara's mother arrived. She got off the bus at the general store with a small suitcase and a presence no suitcase could contain. Her name was Agnes Sullivan. She was 64, with short grey hair, and a way of looking at people that made you feel examined and welcomed at the same time. When she saw her daughter's belly, she was quiet for a second. Then she hugged her. A long hug, the kind that's in no hurry and needs no words. "My girl," she said very softly. Clara couldn't hold it in. She cried right there, in front of the general store, with her mother's suitcase on the ground beside the two of them. Hank had gone to pick up Agnes. He was off to the side, waiting, hat in hand. When they pulled apart, Agnes turned to him. She looked. Hank stood quiet under that mother's gaze that doesn't need to explain anything. "My daughter wrote to me," she said, with no accusation in her tone, just a clean fact. "I came." "She told me," Hank said. "Good, because wherever my daughter is, I show up." She picked up the suitcase. "Show me the house, son-in-law." That week with her mother present, something in the house changed. It wasn't magic. It was presence. It was another voice, another gaze, another way of measuring what was right and what wasn't. Agnes didn't confront Hank head-on. She was too smart for that. But she asked questions he had to answer out loud. "Why is Clara washing clothes standing up? Can't she sit on a little stool while she washes?" "Hank, have you taken her to the doctor to see how the baby's doing?" "That pot's too heavy for her to carry on her own, isn't it?" They were simple questions, but Hank had to answer them, and by answering them out loud he kept hearing himself in a way he wasn't used to. Mrs. Martha Thompson came to visit too. She arrived one afternoon with her knee feeling better, and that calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that life has more layers than it seems. She was 71, with completely white hair tied up in a tight bun, and a smile that appeared slowly, like someone carefully sharing what she had of best. The two older women sat on the porch with Clara and talked for hours. Agnes talked about the Ozarks, about how things had changed since she was young, about births she had attended and children she had raised. Mrs. Martha listened and added things from her own life, and Clara sat between them, absorbing that kind of wisdom you don't learn anywhere, only by living. There was something in that scene, 3 women of different ages, each with her own weight and her own story, that made Clara feel something she hadn't felt with such clarity in a long time, that she wasn't alone. The tenant farming debt was settled with help from Clara's sister. Hank accepted. It wasn't easy for him to accept, but he accepted. They agreed to pay the amount back over the next 2 years in installments without charging interest, like a real family does. Mr. Samuel Thompson, when he heard about the arrangement, did something no one expected. He went to Hank in the field without warning and said he had a harvest needing extra hands and would pay well for the work. "If you're willing, of course." It was a gesture that said a lot without needing to say anything. "I don't judge you for what you were, but I'm keeping an eye on what you'll become." Hank stood looking at the old man for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "You can count on me, Mr. Samuel." That handshake Clara didn't see, but when Hank came back that afternoon with the news of the extra work, she noticed something different in his posture. It was almost as if that handshake had closed one chapter and opened another. The baby was born on a Friday early in the morning, when the sun was still pale orange on the horizon, still finding its place in the sky. It was a girl. And she was named Abigail, as Clara had chosen on her own, months before, on the nights when she would place her hand on her belly and breathe, while the world slept, and the weight of everything seemed heavier than it should have been. Hank stayed outside during the delivery, walking in small circles, stopping every now and then and looking at the door like someone asking for something, without knowing exactly who to ask. Agnes was inside with her daughter and the midwife. Mr. Samuel had stopped by the afternoon before and left a pile of chopped firewood without asking for anything in return. Mrs. Martha had sent a pot of chicken soup over with the neighbor's daughter, along with a note that said, "For later to build your strength back up." When the midwife came out to call Hank, he walked in with that expression of a man who is scared and full of hope at the same time. The two things mixed together on a face that didn't quite know what to do with any of it. Clara was lying down, tired in a way that went all the way to the bone, with the girl at her chest. The morning light came through the window at a low, golden angle. Hank stood still in the doorway for a second. Then he came in slowly. He sat on the edge of the bed without making a sound. He looked at Abigail. The girl was small. She had a round little forehead, and her fingers closed in a loose fist. She slept with that peace only newborns have, as if they still didn't know the world is complicated and is going to demand so much of them. "Abigail," Clara said softly. Hank looked at her. Then he looked back at the girl and repeated the name, slowly, "Abigail," as if he were testing the weight of the word for the first time and discovering it was a good weight. "You'd already picked the name." "I had." He didn't say anything else for a while. He just kept looking at his daughter with that expression Clara hadn't seen on his face in years, completely unguarded, without any tension, without the weight of fear he normally carried on his shoulders. "I don't want her to be afraid of me," he said, in a voice Clara almost didn't recognize. "I don't want to be the kind of father who makes her walk on tiptoes in her own home." "Then don't be." Simple as that. Hard as that. Hank nodded slowly, with the kind of nod that is a promise, even if no one had asked it to be. And Clara felt that this time was different from the others. Not because the words were different, but because there was a little girl between them that made everything more real than it had ever been before. In the months that followed, there were hard days. There always are. But there were also conversations that hadn't existed before. There was Hank asking instead of ordering. There was Clara speaking instead of swallowing her words. There was Abigail growing up in the middle of it all, oblivious to the complications of adults, sleeping and waking and learning that the world had a lap and a warm voice and the smell of food cooking on the stove. Agnes stayed for 3 months. When she left, she cried at the door and told Clara she would write every week, and this time it was a promise kept. The letters arrived right on schedule, full of news from the Ozarks and of that mother's love that doesn't know how to shrink with distance. Mr. Samuel came down the road one afternoon many months later. This time, Clara was on the porch with Abigail in her arms. The girl was almost 4 months old, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, her big eyes taking everything in with that fresh curiosity of someone discovering the world for the first time. The old man stopped his sorrel horse. He looked at the two of them. Clara raised her hand to wave. He waved back. And there was on his face that kind of expression that doesn't need a single word. The expression of someone who bet on another person from afar, without asking for recognition, and saw that it was worth it. Sometimes that's what changes the course of a story. Not a grand speech, not an intervention that makes the news. A man who gets off his horse, who carries a sack, who passes by the same dirt road every week just to make it clear that someone is watching and someone cares. And a woman who learns more slowly than she wanted and faster than she thought she could that asking for help isn't weakness, that calling for her mother isn't defeat, that saying I need to sit down is a right, not a request. Abigail was going to grow up, and she was going to grow up without knowing the weight her mother had carried in her head and in her heart, so that she could come into the world with that peace on her face. Maybe one day Clara would tell her, maybe not. But she kept inside herself, with the care of someone who guards something very precious, the memory of an afternoon with heavy sun, a dirt road the color of old sand, a sack of corn that weighed more than it should, and a man in a hat on a dun horse who didn't just ride on by. Sometimes life changes because of one big decision. Sometimes it changes because of someone who simply doesn't look away from what isn't right. End of the story. I keep thinking a lot about this story. About Mr. Samuel Thompson, who could very well have just kept going down the road. About Clara, who learned to speak when for so long she had only been swallowing her words. About Hank, who carried a pattern he didn't even know he was carrying. We recognize people like that everywhere, don't we? Tell us what you felt listening to this story and where you're watching from. Do you think the real Hank changed? Leave it in the comments. We read everything. Thank you so much for your company, as always. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.